Welcome to Beyond the Coverage. I'm Chris Horner. This is the preview to the 2022 Tour de France. Now, I was asked in the comments who I thought might surprise or which team might surprise me here at the 2022 Tour de France. Now, I got to say the rider that might surprise us all and be in yellow throughout this first 9 stages might be Stefan Kuhn from FDJ. I talked about their team a little bit in yesterday's Beyond the Coverage. And Stefan Kuhn, who has been known as being a pure time trial specialist, he's European individual time trial champion currently, he's got to be the rider that you got to keep an eye out for because he can time trial. He can climb. We saw him in Swiss where he went top 5 on the general classification. And he can get through the cobblestone stage because he was 3rd at Paris-Roubaix this year's edition in 2022. Plus, he's gone top 5 in the classics like Tour of Flanders. So when you look at this parcours, when you look at stage 1 individual time trial, you got to have Stefan Kuhn there as a favorite. But is he a bigger favorite than, say, a rider like Wout van Aert, who has to be the 5-star favorite coming in to this stage 1? Now, remember, we just saw in the news yesterday, Wout van Aert tapped his knee on his handlebar. And so we don't know exactly what his condition will be coming into this stage 1. But if we're not seeing that he's missing training rides coming into this last week, because we start the Tour de France next Friday, so if he's missing training rides, all of a sudden he's no longer a 5-star favorite. But with just a tap on the knee, on the handlebar, I've done that many times throughout my career, and one time I had that where it actually cost me to have to drop out of the Tour of the Basque Country because my knee was swelling up from the efforts done at intense efforts of bike racing. So if Wout van Aert can't get through this next week of solid training, now all of a sudden he's not a favorite for the individual time trial. You look at other riders like Mathieu van der Poel, who may do something in the individual time trial. Tadej Pogacar has to be a favorite. We know he can time trial and win TTs at the Tour de France. We know the Slovenian is on form. And we know he can ride his bike around the corners. So when we're talking about stage 1, Tadej Pogacar's got to be listed. And Stefan Kuhn has to be there from FDJ. But keep in mind, as a surprise rider to be in yellow, Stefan Kuhn could easily be that rider in yellow during these first 9 stages here at the Tour de France. Remember, if he doesn't win the time trial, he can make it across the bridge on stage 2. He can make it through the cobblestone stage on stage 5. He can certainly go up the next 2 climbing stages with the short 1.5 kilometer to the finish on stage 6, and then Planche de Belfi if he is a little bit down on general classification. He's not a GC favorite, so he could be given some rope and just a little bit of leash to be able on Planche de Belfi to escape in a breakaway, go up the road and put himself in the yellow jersey. Now, I want to talk about one other rider, and he's not on the list for Quick-Step at this point in time because they haven't released their roster, 8-rider roster here for the Tour de France. It has to be Julian Alaphilippe. Since 2019, Julian Alaphilippe has surprised us, impressed us, and left us crying through every one of these editions of the Tour de France. And so if he's recovered from his LBL crash that he had in the Spring Classics, when he comes here to this year's edition in 2022, you got to ask yourself what stage looks fantastic for a Julian Alaphilippe rider. Now, I don't expect to see him win the individual time trial on stage 1, but remember, in 2019, he did win the individual time trial that year, so if he comes with fantastic flying form, something might be possible on that individual time trial of stage 1 here at this year's Tour de France. But if that doesn't happen, when you're talking about Julian Alaphilippe, the next 2-3 sprint stages isn't perfect for the French rider. The cobblestone stage probably not quite there in his wheelhouse. Now when we start talking stage 6 and Planche de Belfi, all of a sudden we're talking about a stage that can put a Julian Alaphilippe in the race leader's jersey. Let me remind you guys, in 2019, he had the race leader's jersey going into Planche de Belfi, and then he lost it with the breakaway going up the road where Dylan Teuns won the stage, and Giulio Ciccone from Trek Segafredo put himself in the race leader's yellow jersey, while Julian Alaphilippe just lost out by a few seconds on that stage with a massive acceleration and attack on all the GC favorites of Geraint Thomas, who came to the line there all together, but lost about 1:45, 2 minutes if I remember correctly, and then gave up the race leader's jersey, was able to get himself back into it, and then, like I said, put on a fantastic flying show in the individual time trial to alter that 2019 Tour de France to all degrees of what we had expected and surprise us all. So when I'm looking at the comments, I'm going to say, if I'm picking out 2 riders, Julian Alaphilippe, won't necessarily be surprised by it, but if there's a stage where he's going to come out and show, I think it's going to come after the cobblestone stage, and it might be when he lost on Planche de Belfi, the race leader's yellow jersey. We might see him back in it, and I love Stefan Kuhn because he can make it through the time trials, he can make it through the cobbles, and he's climbing well enough to go in the breakaways on Planche de Belfi and possibly gain back any time to put him in the race leader's jersey. Now, one team that just announced their 8-rider roster is DSM. DSM has come with a great squad. This team always seems to be a little bit down on my radar, but when you look at this team this year, it really looks magnificent because, of course, Romain Bardet, who was flying at this year's Giro d'Italia, but then went left when he got sick. Now you got to believe that coming from the Giro where he had some solid training there, left sick, but plenty of time to recover, and then come into this Tour de France. If he can carry that kind of form from the Giro d'Italia, if the two Slovenians have problems during this first week and they're down or out of this year's Tour de France, we got to add Romain Bardet in there as a possible winner here at this year's Tour de France. Now, we look deeper on the DSM roster. Alberto Danesi, who won a stage at the Giro this year in the field sprint, he was spectacular in that stage win. You got to believe that he's been motivated since winning his big first Grand Tour victory at this year's Giro. And now with this month's worth of time to prepare for the Tour de France, he's got to be exceptionally motivated for DSM to try to take another Grand Tour victory here in 2022. If he does, we've got to ask ourselves, will Alberto Danesi show up at the Vuelta so he can try to win one stage in each of the Grand Tours here in 2022? Look a little bit deeper in the roster when you're talking about Romain Bardet. He's going to need a little bit of help, and you got to believe it's going to come from Chris Hamilton when they get into the mountains. Now, we go a little bit further into the DSM 8-rider roster. It's a very interesting team here, and this is why I want to go just a little bit deeper, because John Degenkolb is here on the team. Let me remind you guys, 2018, when they went over the cobblestone stage of that year's Tour de France, it was John Degenkolb who took a fantastic win that day in the Tour de France. And let me go a little bit deeper for John Degenkolb. On his resume, he does have the 2015 Paris-Roubaix victory there. So John Degenkolb and DSM come with a solid stack squad here to go GC, to go individual stage sprint victories with Alberto Danesi, and of course John Degenkolb for the cobblestone stage 5 here at this year's Tour de France. Now when we look at complete teams that might surprise us at this year's 2022 Tour de France, you got to think about Trek Segafredo. They got ex-Road World Champion in there, Mads Pedersen. If they bring him, they haven't released their whole squad yet, but you got to believe Mads Pedersen's going to show up here at this year's Tour de France. So he can make it through this time trial, possibly be one of the bigger favorites to win that first stage individual time trial, but if not, he can sprint. So if he can stay close on the stage 1 individual time trial or win it, then of course he's going to surprise if he beats Wout van Aert. But if he doesn't get yellow on the individual time trial, remember, he can sprint, he can get time bonuses later on, and he can ride the cobblestones. So Trek Segafredo could be the team that really surprises us here again with a rider like Giulio Ciccone, Bach Mollema possibly taken when we get to Planche de Belfi, the yellow, by getting away in breakaways. Or of course, their classic riders that are on the squad that could possibly get themselves into the race leader's jersey from the individual time trial or the sprint stages that are later to come, followed by the cobblestone stage. One last team before I let you guys go, Bahrain Victorious. They have a depth of team that's solid through 8 guys. They always have a rider that's going to go solid in the top 10 of the general classification, if not the top 5. And they're always going to have riders that could be up the road in breakaway stages. So when you're looking at this first 9 stages here at the Tour de France before we get to the second rest stage, keep an eye out for Bahrain Victorious because they can surprise from the breakaway for certain. And then, of course, they're going to have 1 or 2 riders that are racing for the general classification, top 10, top 5s, possibly even podium here at this year's Tour de France, depending on who crashes out and what it looks like after the first 5 stages and we finish the cobblestone stage here at the Tour de France. Make sure you guys like and subscribe, and I'll keep you updated best I can with some inside little stories here on Beyond the Coverage, and I'll see you on the next edition real soon.